I'm ready as well. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. We're going to move in to kind of hopefully overlap a little bit between the end of Unit 2 and the beginning of Unit 3. So kind of juggling a couple of things here. First talking about mineral nutrition and then getting into the management of soils. So let's go ahead and get into the presentation here. All right. So mineral nutrition, we're talking about the actual nutrients that are used for crop growth, and a little bit about how soils interact with those nutrients. So first, just recognizing that the nutrients are not just simply absorbed directly into plant cells. There are some barriers, some systems to move the nutrients into the roots. Same as what we were talking about last week with photosynthesis and water. So generally, important thing to recognize is that there is a strong attraction for each nutrient that a plant needs. And there are different systems that regulate how those nutrients are actually taken up and absorbed and used by the plants for each nutrient. It's also important to recognize that the nutrients are not just simply absorbed in their elemental form. They are absorbed in ionic form. And really the issue with ions is that basically they have less or more electrons, and these are really how they exist in nature. Rarely do any elements actually exist in their natural form and their elemental form. So we have different charges of these elements and these ionic forms. So we have the cations that are positively charged, and the anions that are negatively charged, and that's how they are actually taken up into the plants. And most of these ions in the soil are stuck to little particles in the soil, but then are actually absorbed into the water first, and then the water is absorbed by the plant and absorbing the nutrients. And once they are absorbed into the root system, they're moved through the two plant tissues, the xylem and the phloem. Xylem, the upward movement of water and ions, can also be downward in some cases. The phloem, kind of, we're thinking more of the food, but it's moving the photosynthates from the leaves, the nutrients that are fixed there, into other plant parts, downward and laterally. So we can see here, going from the root itself, the xylem tissues in the pink and the phloem tissues in the brown. So the root hairs are actually what is absorbing the different nutrients, bring them into the xylem and the phloem. And you might notice that they have several barriers that they have to go through here. The root tip here is not actually absorbing nutrients. That's just where root growth is occurring. So we got the phloem in the brown delivering the nutrients from the leaves to the growing roots, and that extends further than the xylem, because it's actually going down here into this meristematic zone where the cells are actively dividing. That's where the roots need the food. There's also this Casparian strip here, kind of right on the outside of these different cells, that are basically just waxy deposits that are preventing movement of water and ions into the xylem directly. and kind of mediating that transfer of those nutrients. We have to get through that Casparian strip. Plant cell walls, as we discussed, are composed of the carbohydrate cellulose and hemicellulose, as well as pectin. But this composition is creating a porous cell wall. And the spaces in these fibers and pectin, these pores, are what are allowing the flow of ions and water into the root and then up through the plant. So here's just an image of that. And actually how we have kind of two different types of movement, symplastic and apoplastic movement, where basically we have apoplastic movement here, which is relatively unimpeded and is kind of going sort of between the cell walls, whereas the symplastic is moving within that membrane only and into the xylem. So this is kind of a cross section looking from above of the root. We got our root tips over here. We got the cortex, the Casparian strip, which these nutrients have to flow through, and then actually flowing into the xylem itself to be moved upwards into the plant. The endodermis, think of that just as like an interior skin, and it's composed of cells with walls that are impregnated with a waxy substance called suberin. And suberin is what it's a chemical that plants use partially to heal, but it's this impenetrable barrier for both water and ions. So we have to have a special way to get through that barrier, and that is through the plasma membrane or the plasma lamella, depending on how it's moving. If the ion is passing through that plasma membrane further out in the root or at the endodermis, it can move to the xylem, cell to cell through that cytoplasm itself, and that is the symplastic movement that is pictured here versus the apoplastic movement. So how do the ions actually get through the plasma membrane? How do they get through this barrier? It's kind of the same as we were talking about with photosynthesis. We've got these proteins that are embedded in the membrane that actually serve as channels or carriers for the ions, specific proteins for specific nutrients. So some of these exist on the outside of the cell wall, some of them are existing on the inside, and they're moving it through the membrane. And these different nutrients can enter the plant at different rates. Some elements, some of these nutrients are interacting synergistically with the elements. Some of them are antagonistically. So some of them are working together, some of them are working against each other, which is where we get the whole idea of nutrient imbalances. Some that are preventing the uptake of other nutrients. So for example, potassium uptake could be enhanced by adding calcium to the soil because they interact synergistically together. They work with each other. Phosphorus, on the other hand, if we have too much of it, it can interfere with the uptake of iron in a plant. So these are antagonistic to each other. Phosphorus prevents iron from getting in. Let's just talk about the essential elements. And to be considered essential, then basically the plant needs that nutrient to complete part of its life cycle. And depending on who you talk to, we have 16 or 17 essential chemical elements known for the growth of most plants, listed here. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, which they're the major nutrients. And if we look at the bulk of a plant, if it's completely dried out, then most of the body of the plant is in that carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Recognize that that just is also the formulation of the starches, sugars in the plant. So it makes sense that is the actual bulk of the plant. Those are actually taken up through the air and through the water mostly, and some through organic matter in the soil. The rest of them are taken up through the soil itself. Sometimes they can be taken up through leaves, kind of depends on the plant. So here's just a little limerick here. C. Hopkins Cafe, managed by my cousins, Mo, Nigel, and Clyde. A way to remember these 17 essential elements. C for carbon, hydrogen, H in Hopkins, and then OPKNS, the rest of Hopkins there, oxygen, phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen, sulfur, Cafe, calcium and iron, CAFE, magnesium, Mg, boron, manganese, copper, zinc, and my cousins, Mo, Nigel, and Clyde, molybdenum, nickel, and chlorine. So it's important to recognize that those are the essential elements for plant growth. And if we don't have any of those elements, then the plant cannot complete its life cycle. As I mentioned there, the bulk, 95%, in some cases more than that, of the plant's dry weight is composed through the CHOs, the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And those are coming from air and water mostly, and some of the organic matter in the soil. The rest of the mineral nutrients that are coming from the soil, we divide into different groups according to how much they are needed and used by plants. So we have the primary macronutrients, macro meaning large amounts, the N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. The secondary macronutrients, and if we were to look at, what is left in that plant, a good 3% or so is nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. Then we have the micronutrients, which are also referred to as trace elements. And it's important to note that we don't, say that they're, just because we need them in less quantities, doesn't make them any less necessary. It just means that we need them in smaller amounts. So here's just a chart that looks at these mineral nutrients and some examples of their roles in the plant. And really, we're thinking mostly of the major macronutrients, primary and secondary macronutrients, as what their uses are in the plant. The rest of them, although they're still very important, I don't think you necessarily need to memorize what they're used for. But nitrogen, the big thing about it is it's for the synthesis of amino acids. It's actually used in chlorophyll and in the nucleic acids, as well as production of proteins. So nitrogen is basically, because it's used in chlorophyll, we can think of it as the leaf producer. What causes plants to be dark green because of its use in chlorophyll. So if you have lots of nitrogen, your plants are going to be green. If we start to see lighter green or yellowing of plants, the first thing that we go to is a nitrogen deficiency. Phosphorus, also used in all kinds of different processes in the plants and proteins and in photosynthesis, as well as respiration. We kind of think of it more for the production of flowers and fruits. Potassium more for the production of roots, as well as very important in the opening and closing of the stomata, those pores on the underside of the leaves, which helps to regulate water in the plants. It's also very important in flower buds. Calcium, very similar as what we need for in people. It's a structural component, so it's used in cell walls as well as cell growth and division. It's also synergistic with several elements such as nitrogen. Think of it as being used in the skins of fruits as well as just the body of the plant. Magnesium is essential in the formation of chlorophyll as well, and is also essential in the formation of fats and sugars. Calcium and magnesium are somewhat synergistic, but also in some cases can be antagonistic to each other. Sulfur, the final secondary macronutrient, it's also an essential ingredient in amino acids as well as some vitamins. It gives flavor in particular plants, such as the cabbage family and onions, things that we think of having that pungent kind of sulfury odor. Also important in regulating the pH in the soil. Right, so if we have all of those essential elements, then the plant will grow. It will finish its life cycle just like it would regularly. If there is even one single element that is not present in sufficient quantities, then that plant will not grow and develop properly based on that one element. And basically we can't get it to finish its life cycle, to produce optimally, unless we have that element in sufficient quantities. So this is where the law of the minimum comes in. Any one element can limit the plant's complete life cycle. It's also important to think about how the elements and nutrients can move in the plant. So the immobile elements are stuck. Once they're fixed in part of the plant, they cannot be moved. The mobile elements, on the other hand, can be moved. So as a plant grows, they will kind of scavenge these mobile elements from older tissues. So we'll start to see deficiency in the older tissues, deficiency symptoms. Nitrogen is one of the most mobile nutrients, and it is required in such large amounts in plants because it is found in all the proteins. And it is the most commonly deficient in plant growing systems and cropping because it is so mobile. It moves in the soil as well as moving in the plant. And there are only two forms of nitrogen that plants can actually absorb and utilize. And that's ammonium, NH4, as a cation with a positive charge, and nitrate, NO3, as an anion, a negative charge. The unavailable forms that exist are made available to plants through the nitrogen cycle, which is akin to the carbon cycle and critical to life on Earth. So if we think back, we were talking about how nitrogen is actually the largest component of air. We have lots of nitrogen floating around, and there's different ways that it is actually fixed and brought into the soil. There's a little bit less nitrogen in soil air than there is in atmospheric air. So we have N2 as atmospheric nitrogen, and it is fixed by nitrogen fixing bacteria in the roots of some plants, especially the legumes. It can also be fixed by lightning, which fixes it as nitrate in the soil. And also found in the bodies of animals, for instance. So as animals, and their byproducts, their waste products, are emptied to the soil, basically they become part of it and are mineralized into ammonium in this case. And then as they decay and are decomposed by microorganisms in the soil, they are turned in some cases into ammonium, nitrate, which then is the most accessible form of nitrogen in the plants. And then in the plant itself, it's synthesized into the proteins, into the chlorophyll and other nitrogen containing metabolites, and can be returned to the soil or exported. One of the big things I think in crop production is that we are, by removing parts of our crops, parts of the plants, we're removing nutrients. We have to replace them. Otherwise, we'll have a net loss. So nitrogen fixation, as we just talked about, is carried out in some plants, and that's the conversion of that atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia by types of bacteria and fungi in the soil. The one that is most important for agriculture is the rhizobia, which is several different genera and many different species of bacteria that are actually infecting the roots and live in the nodules of the roots, the legumes. In some of our crops, such as peas and beans, our cover crops, like vetch, for instance, also in soybeans and alfalfa, and some trees, such as locusts. As I mentioned, we are actually growing some of these legumes as cover crops and then plowing them under or killing them with herbicides to return nitrogen to the soil as they're fixing that nitrogen, pulling it out of the air. It's a symbiotic relationship. So here on the left, we've got the actual nodules on the roots of the plant. The plant is supplying the bacteria that live in these nodules, first with a home, but also with the carbohydrates, the sugars that the bacteria need to survive. And the bacteria are supplying the plant with a form of nitrogen, often ammonia. So this is what it looks like under a microscope in those nodules, actually, and then looking at it as in an electron microscope, the actual bacteria existing in those parts of the plant. Pretty cool. So we have those rhizobia entering the root on these nodules, and then we can see those tissues and how it's moving that nitrogen to the tissues. We're talking about millions of bacteria living in these roots of the plant in this symbiotic relationship. For synthetic nitrogen, we actually manufacture ammonia for fertilizer through the Haber-Bosch process, which is converting that atmospheric nitrogen to ammonia at very high temperature and pressure, and with some sort of catalyst present to kind of bind it, often to like a salt-based fertilizer. It happens under a lot of very high temperatures, a lot of pressure, in order to get that nitrogen from air into an ammonia form that we can then apply as a fertilizer. So it's an energy intensive and expensive process, but it's responsible for great yields in agriculture. This happens basically the same way in the bacteria in the nodules or in the soil as well. It doesn't just exist in the nodules of the legumes. These bacteria also exist in the soil. And the difference, though, is that these bacteria in the natural process are able to do it much more efficiently than we can in the industrial process. So they're doing it at room temperature and pressure with the help of sugar from the plant. Pretty neat. The nitrogen availability is going to depend on the transformation of the atmospheric nitrogen into the mineral forms that are actually able to be taken up by the plant. That starts with mineralization or ammonification, which is the conversion of that organic form of the nitrogen into ammonia. And then ammonium is converted to nitrate through nitrification. We can actually supply it in different forms, though, but it still has to be converted in the soil before plants can actually take it up. And nitrate is an anion and can be easily leached from the soil just by natural rainfall or over irrigation. Again, nitrogen in all of its forms is very mobile, but as an anion is even more mobile and can easily be leached from the soil. So as I mentioned earlier, the first symptom of nitrogen deficiency appears as just an overall yellowing. And we'll see that first in the lower leaves. Because nitrogen is mobile, it's going to move from the lower leaves and the plants are going to utilize it in the newer growth. And basically, if we don't supply nitrogen to the plant, then eventually it's going to run out of the nitrogen in the plant to move. So we have to supply it in order to correct that problem. Phosphorus has all kinds of different vital roles in the cell. It is actually a component of DNA and RNA. It's very important in just the movement of nutrients through the plant, the movement of energy through ATP and NADPH. We usually think of phosphorus as being the second most limiting element for plant growth. And that's mostly because much of that phosphorus in the soil is tied up in organic matter and tightly held by these compounds. It's also only slightly soluble. So we really need to look at the pH for the availability of phosphorus. If it's more acidic, if it's below a 6, or if it's more basic, above an 8, then that can inhibit the uptake of phosphorus. So it's a very narrow range at which phosphorus is available, which makes it so crucial. And we actually have a similar symbiotic relationship for phosphorus with plants, except this is with a fungi, mycorrhizal fungi, that form a sheath around the surface of the roots and basically are growing into the roots of the plant that are kind of the same deal. It's a symbiotic relationship. The plant is providing the sugar and a habitat for it, and the mycorrhiza is helping to take up phosphorus into the xylem of the root. Here's just an image looking at that. We basically have this fungus growing in between these cells and carrying it into the plant in exchange for those carbohydrates. Both rhizobium and mycorrhiza, we can actually purchase and apply them to the soil so that we know that we have that fungi and bacteria in there to, basically allow for the uptake of these nutrients. So for phosphorus, what we usually see is a deficiency symptom. Also, again, we're going to see it first in the lower leaves. It's not as mobile as nitrogen, but it still can be moved from older leaves into newer leaves. So we'll first see it in the lower leaves. They'll be dark green and often red or purplish in color. And if it's not corrected, then the plant eventually cannot, continue to move it. If it is not corrected, the plant will become spindly. Fortunately, there are, several ways that several formulations of applying phosphorus as a fertilizer to the soil to make up for that loss. Potassium, the K is also critical for plant growth, especially in the opening and closing of the stomata, so that the plant can respire and photosynthesize and transpire. It's also required for the activation of many different types of enzymes. Potassium exists as a cation and is retained in the soil because of this positive charge. It's not easily leached away. So we have lots of sources of potassium that are plentiful, and mineral sources of potassium that can be used directly. Potassium, can also be supplied through burning off of, crop residues. Pot ash, if you've heard that being said before, is potassium. And they actually used to get it through actually burning crop residues in a pot and applying that ash to the soil. We have the lower leaves of, in this case, we've got a soybean here of broadleaf plants showing chlorosis. And notice that it's interveinal chlorosis in the case of the broadleaf plants in between the veins. We get this yellowing. And we'll also get some necrosis, actually death of tissues, and the browning starting at the margins of the leaf. In monocots, though, or grasses, etc., happens a little bit differently. The symptoms usually start at the tip and then spread along the margins. And then if that's uncorrected, it will happen for the entire leaf and eventually cause it to die. Calcium, first, the structural part is it's part of the pectin, causes a stable structure. And if we have deficiency in calcium, it's partially just because a lack of calcium, but also because of an inability to transport calcium to rapidly growing tissues. It happens a little bit slower. And what will happen is that the skin, the tissues will collapse and become soft and appear to be rotted. It sometimes can look like a disease. So we see that as often like it's a tip burn in lettuce. We can see this also in tomatoes. It will appear as like a brown, looks like a rotting patch on the bottom of the fruit, which is called blossom end rot. So it's a physical issue, but it often kind of looks like a disease, and many people incorrectly think that it's blight. And if you think about that, I mean, diagnosing these nutrient deficiencies is extremely important, because if we think that it's blight and we're applying a fungicide, it's not going to do anything if it's just a lack of calcium. Calcium, it's slowly moved through the plant. So one way that we can correct it is through foliar applications. It can prevent, or in some cases even somewhat reverse, a problem in leaves and fruit. So here's calcium deficiency in pansies. We're getting deformed growth because it just doesn't have enough calcium to have that pectin in the cells that allow it to stand up strong, have that turgidity in the cells. Magnesium also has several roles, but one of the big ones is that it's an essential component of the chlorophyll itself. It's also critical for energy transfer in the plant. So we also see it as a intraveinal chlorosis of lower leaves. That in between the veins distinguishes it from nitrogen deficiency. Usually we're applying things like Epsom salts, magnesium sulfate to correct that in soils that are deficient of magnesium. We'll take a look at a few of the minor elements as well. First, iron. And iron is often a deficiency problem in soil, mostly due to pH. It's very pH dependent, and it is an immobile element. So we'll see a different type of deficiency symptom. Usually we see it as intraveinal chlorosis in between the veins of the upper foliage. It's happening in the new growth because it's immobile. It can't be used from old leaves. So we see that in the pansy here. The new leaves here are basically devoid of iron, and we're seeing that intraveinal chlorosis. So we can apply a foliar application of iron. Since it's immobile, it's important to put it basically where it's needed. So we can do a foliar application, and see this term chelate here. That's basically a form, it's been chemically altered of the iron, basically just as a way to get it into the leaves. Often the best way to correct soil pH issues with iron is just to change the pH in order to make it more available, because it's often there, it just might not be available enough. So whenever we're diagnosing plant problems, first we need to look at the nutrient deficiencies, and ideally we can look at that in the plant level and the crop itself. Ideally, we're going to try to correct those ahead of time by looking at a soil test. So we want to look at multiple symptoms. It's difficult to rely just on one thing. It can be misleading because the deficiency symptoms can vary from plant to plant or crop to crop. And often, if we have one element deficient, usually there's more than one, and that compounds it, and you can get symptoms that can really look different as a result. A lot of them also can look like plant disease or other disorders. But of course, you're not going to correct them. If it's not a disease, it has to be only corrected by providing that nutrient. So one good strategy to try to confirm or deny diagnosis, first, let's think about doing a soil test. It's, if you do that test, then it takes a while to get that test back. But so we might look at it in a particular plant and just apply a small amount of the nutrient, the element, to confirm or deny that diagnosis, and then not apply it until deficiency is confirmed, because that could just be a waste of money. You can also do some soil and leaf analysis, where we're sending off the plant tissues to a laboratory, or there's some tools that we can also use for that. They're often pretty expensive though. So if you think about how these nutrients are moved, the plants are always trying to produce seeds. Reproduction is their main goal. So the plant is going to allocate resources to the production of seeds. And we look at that through remobilization of the nutrients themselves. And in doing so, the plants are just moving them from, if they're mobile nutrients, from older tissues to newer growth. And here's just some charts looking at the remobilization of the nutrients throughout the life cycle of the plant. Notice as you move later on, more of those nutrients are being moved, from just leaf production into stem and pod production into actual seeds themselves. All right, so with the time we have left, I'm going to go ahead and switch here into chapter 14. It's a little bit longer, so we'll go ahead and get started on it. Just looking at how we manage soil and water, and together the fertility of the plant and soil. Unfortunately, we're not breaking these up into individual distinct components. They're all, soil, water, and fertility management are all very tightly integrated. So what we're going to do in one area can impact the other two areas. So we're looking at them kind of all together. And we're going to start with kind of just preparing the land itself, preparing the soil. And in preparing the soil, we're looking at several purposes to actually get optimal crop growth. First thing is just the grading of the soil, trying to get it closer to level so that it's easier to produce crops where needed. We can also incorporate crop residues, green manures, cover crops through land preparation, actually get some of those nutrients in a biological form into the soil. We'll also look at improving or maintaining the tilth of the soil, its actual texture in that mix of air and water based on the structure of the soil itself. Land preparation also helps to control weeds, diseases, and insects, our pest problems. It can also help to control erosion where practical. Note that land preparation is also, if done incorrectly, can cause more erosion than control it. So tilth and tillage we look at as the actual mechanical manipulation of the soil to provide a favorable environment for the crop growth. So The effective tillage is going to improve the soil moisture holding capacity. It's also going to improve seed to soil contact for the germination of seeds. So ideally, through tillage, we're altering the soil so that they should hold enough water to maintain the plant for hopefully several days in between irrigations, while still maintaining enough air in the soil, those air pockets, to reach the roots so that they're able to breathe, basically, to respire. So we mentioned early on, we were talking about soil, how the ideal agricultural soil, we look at it as being half solid, the mineral and organic components of the soil, and then half open or pore space. And then of that 50% that is open or pore space, ideally we want that to be half air and half water, so that we can get the proper drainage and still allow roots to respire while still holding enough water for the plant to be able to photosynthesize. So soil, first and foremost, if we're growing crops from seeds, it should provide an environment that is conducive to the rapid germination and emergence of seeds to get good plant growth. And for most of our crops, that means that we want a soil surface that is loose, full of pore spaces, free of big chunks and clods. So generally through tillage, we're breaking up these clods to get better soil to seed contact. Leveling is important to permit the flow of water and to spread it evenly throughout a soil surface without causing erosion. Whenever we're working soil, it's important to recognize that we want it to be kind of the Goldilocks, level of moisture. And we don't want it too wet when we're working soil, because if we're working wet soil, then that's going to reduce the air spaces, those air pockets, and destroy the soil structure. We don't want it too dry, because then it becomes subject to erosion from wind. It's also destroying the structure and makes it easier to compact. So we want it to be just the right soil moisture to be able to work it readily. We think of arable land as being, fairly flat and level, and then we're going to work it to be flat and level. And the big thing for that is being able to easily work it, easily harvest crops, easily able to irrigate it. Especially if we're using, like in this image, the flood and furrow irrigation that is used with many row crops. So we look at working the soil as first as plowing. And plowing, we're using a mechanical implement to invert the soil, turn what is, the topsoil upside down, basically, which is also burying residues from previous vegetation, could be removing weeds. But plowing itself is basically leaves large amounts of residues on the field or on the soil surface. Also, it leaves large linear lumps where we're inverting that soil surface. Whenever we're looking at plows, there's two general types of plows: a moldboard plow or a disc plow. And we can have several of those in one implement. We could have one single one, but it's basically shearing and inverting a slice of soil. So it's leaving it completely inverted, so the bottom is now the top. So here we see a group of plows moving multiple furrows at one time. So I'm not going to dwell too much on the different types of plows, but I think it's also important to recognize the chisel plow, which is slightly different shape than the moldboard plow, which we kind of think is the traditional plow shape. The chisel plow is more just like a curved shank that is spread widely. And chiseling has its own place in different soil types. It can be done more quickly than moldboard plowing. It's going to disturb the soil left, and however, it's going to leave more quantities of crop residue on the soil surface, which is better for ground that is not as level, because it's going to leave that on the surface to provide erosion control. Also, the chisel plows go a little bit deeper than the moldboard plows, and because of that, they are rapidly replacing moldboard plows in a lot of agricultural situations. We're talking about disc plowing. There's a difference here between a disc plow and a disc harrow. And that's basically what they're doing. The actual disc plow is actually cutting into the soil. Usually it's going to have some weight on the back to press those discs into the soil. And often we have a group of these discs on a plow, pulling them behind. And the benefit of the plow disc is that we're not as concerned about soil moisture conditions when we're using the disc plow. Disking, which is slightly different than plowing, using the same kind of concept, these round discs, but we're using them as a harrow. So they're smaller in diameter than the plows, and they're basically used to reduce the size of the soil clods left after we plow. So they're fracturing them with cleavage and pressure. Again, we want weight on the back to break up these clods. So generally, disking follows plowing. Under some good soil conditions, especially after we've plowed them, and if we've really maintained them well, keeping the soil covered through cover crops, often we don't necessarily need to plow again. In some cases, we can just disc it if it is in good tilth. Here's just another image of disking using a stubble disc that has little notches around the periphery of the disc blade, and these help to cut crop residues even more effectively. Harrowing in general is just reducing that soil clod size, and we can do that for disking, or we can do it after disking. It's used to smooth that soil surface, and in some cases we might also do it as a way to control small weeds, and we might even do it several days after, allowing some of those weeds to come back after doing some plowing and disking. And it can also do some small scale grading and leveling as well. It can be the final touch to field preparation. So we plow, we disc, we may harrow, and here is a spring tooth harrow pictured here, which we're using for seed bed preparation, because basically as it springs up, it applies more pressure down to reduce the clod sizes, breaking up soil crust and also destroying small weeds. We also have listing and ridging, and this is generally a plow or can be used in several different implements that are often like two moldboards that are cutting a furrow slice two ways, that are used to basically form like a raised bed to make a soil ridge 8 to 10 inches higher at variable widths depending on how those plows are spaced. And the listers were able to equip different attachments to it. And in this image, we basically combine different implements to list the row where it's mounding that soil up, also potentially even planting plants if there's a planter attached to it, fertilizing as well, laying irrigation lines. Also in many cases, especially in vegetable crops, they're also laying irrigation lines underneath the plastic. And it's doing it in such a way that it's laying that plastic and then mounting the soil over top of it as well. Doing all of this at one time. So that's one of the things that we're looking at in the ag technology world, we're combining implements together to make it easier for crops to basically optimize, use less energy to do more at once. And on that note, we are out of time, so we'll go ahead and sign off for the day. Anybody have any questions or concerns? All righty. Well, we will see you guys on Wednesday.